This is Camp Countdown, a Toronto Maple Leafs podcast series. I'm your host, Kyle Cushman, and on today's show, we're talking about Philippe Myers, recently signed by the Maple Leafs back in July, and projects to be a very intriguing depth piece or a very important piece for the Toronto Marlies this upcoming season. Feels like Myers has been around for forever, but he's still only 27 years old. And at 6'6", 220 pounds as a right shot defenseman with NHL experience and coming off of an excellent season in the AHL, there's a lot to like about Myers as either a guy that can push for NHL minutes at the bottom of the lineup or anchor top pairing in the American Hockey League. The past 2 seasons he played for the Syracuse Crunch in the Tampa Bay Lightning organization, played 16 NHL games over those 2 seasons, and was primarily a Crunch defenseman. Had a solid season in 22-23 in that first year in the organization, but really came into his own last year, at least defensively, with a plus 29 rating, one of the best two-way defensive defensemen at even strength in the AHL last year. Scored 4 goals, 23 points in 61 games as he focused on the defensive side of the game, and that really showed up in some of his even strength results. We don't have a lot of advanced stats at the AHL level, really no advanced stats at the AHL level, but through the great tracking through AHL Tracker, we can kind of pull some stats and kind of figure out some, not necessarily advanced stats, but manipulate some data in a way that at least gives us a little bit more than goals, assists, points, plus minus, penalty minutes, the basic stuff that you get at the American Hockey League level. And when doing that, at least last season with Philippe Myers, you really start to see an intriguing piece. Didn't really get any power play time, had no power play points last season. When he played on special teams, it was on the penalty kill. But at even strength, very, very strong numbers for Myers with the Syracuse Crunch last season. Myers' even strength production has been pretty consistent over the past couple of seasons in the American Hockey League, and ranking above the 75th percentile in even strength, primary points, assists, goals, all that kind of stuff. But what took the biggest jump last season was going from a good offensive defenseman who had some defensive struggles to going to an elite two-way defenseman. Ranked in the 90th percentile in even strength goals for per game when he was on the ice, 71st percentile in even strength goals against per game when he was on the ice, and that resulted being in the 92nd percentile in even strength goals for among AHL defensemen, and in the 96th percentile in even strength goals for percentage relative to his team. And I know I just threw a bunch of numbers at you there that you might be, what does all that mean? What essentially that means is that Philippe Myers was better than 96% of all AHL defensemen in terms of the even strength goal share when he was on the ice versus the rest of his teammates. And of course, that's essentially a fancy way of talking about plus minus, but instead of just kind of being the raw plus minus total that doesn't really tell you a lot about how the player got there, I think it's a lot more interesting or a lot more telling about a player's play style and what they excelled at when you kind of dive into some of those per game numbers and things like that. So it's not the end all be all, but what that kind of tells you is that Myers took a big step defensively at that level last season and was one of the most important defensemen to his team in the entire AHL last year. And again, when you factor in some of his NHL experience, his handful of years now in the AHL, and kind of refining his game last season after a couple of tough seasons at the NHL and even AHL levels, start to create an interesting player there when matched with, of course, his 6'6" frame and some of his past pedigree and some of the tools he has as a physical 6'6" guy who can move pretty well and can jump in the offensive game as need be. And there's a lot to like there, as at the very least a depth player at the NHL who can play in a pinch, but also as a guy that can lead your American Hockey League defense corps. And that's exactly what he did last year with the Crunch. He wasn't necessarily the guy on the Crunch's defense corps in 22-23, but he absolutely was that last season. And we'll get to that a little bit more in our conversation coming up. But more about Myers as a player, I think it's easy to forget kind of his trajectory to where he is right now, because you might forget that he was actually undrafted. Didn't get selected in the 2015 NHL entry draft after playing as a depth defenseman with Ruin Noranda that season, but was signed prior to his post-draft season by the Philadelphia Flyers. And it's one of the things that I love most. It's such a niche thing in hockey, but it's something that I think can really be taken advantage of by certain teams, and especially teams like in the Leafs case who don't necessarily have a lot of draft capital. After the draft, so July whatever, until the start of the new Canadian Hockey League season, teams have that window to sign any player in the Canadian Hockey League to a contract. Of course, if the player doesn't have NHL rights previously owned. So if you're, say, a player like Philippe Myers who isn't drafted in 2015, you can still sign an NHL contract as an undrafted free agent until that next season starts. And so for teams like the Leafs or different teams at the time, the Flyers, who maybe want to supplement their prospect pool but don't have a lot of draft picks, if you have the contract slots and are willing to commit a contract to a player, you can still add some prospects that are 18, 19 years old. Basically add free 7th round picks, just commit the contract right away. And that's what the Flyers did at the time. They saw enough from Myers at development camp, in training camp, in rookie camp, all that stuff to go, you know what, we think there's a player here, we're going to commit a contract. And Myers proved them right pretty much right away. He had a huge post-draft season in 15-16, putting up 45 points in 63 games after scoring just 8 points the year prior. A plus 52 rating, a huge postseason as well with Ruin Noranda winning the QMJHL title. And with that performance, became legitimately a top 50 prospect in hockey. He was ranked inside the top 40 by people like Craig Button. The next season, he again started the season very well. He made Team Canada at the World Juniors as an undrafted player. And so all of a sudden, in the span of a couple years, he went from undrafted, a fringe free agent signing by the Flyers that nobody really pays attention to, all of a sudden to being a top 50 prospect in hockey as a 6'6" right-hand defenseman who has developed an offensive game, is physical, can play two-way, all the stuff, and shot up prospect rankings and became a legitimate prospect in hockey. And after one season in the AHL in 17-18, he made his NHL debut, played for Team Canada at the World Championships at the end of that season, and was an NHL player. His first basically full NHL season came in 1920 when he played 50 games, scored 16 points, had a plus 17 rating with the Flyers, played in 16 playoff games, and seemed like he was going to be a long-term piece of the Flyers defense group. I mean, 6'6", can move pretty well, has a shot from the point, like all of these factors. You think that he's going to be around for a while. And the Flyers kind of saw that as well. They signed him to a 3-year contract in December 2020, $7.65 million over 3 years for a cap hit of $2.55 million. And they kind of saw him as a piece that they could build a top 4 pairing around. And that season just didn't really pan out in 2021. -10, plus minus, again, not a huge stat, but something worth noting given he went from plus 17 to a -10 there. 11 points in 44 games and was ultimately traded after that season, along with Nolan Patrick, for Ryan Ellis. And in Nashville, things didn't really pan out as well. Just 4 points in 27 games, was waived, and that's where things get a little bit interesting here. At that point, instead of reporting to Milwaukee, which was the Predators and still is the Predators' AHL affiliate, he comes to the Toronto Marlies on loan. And he plays 16 games, puts up 7 points in that span. And there's some thought that maybe he ends up in Toronto, obviously being on loan and things like that. But being an under 26 player with that $2.55 million cap hit, the team that buys him out would get that 2/3 buyout and would actually get a cap credit for buying him out. Instead, he gets traded to Tampa Bay, and instead of buying him out, they sign him to a contract extension. They sign him for a 1-year deal at $1.4 million. Julien Brisebois sees the physical tools, and they believe that they can revitalize his career and kind of get him back to being what he was. And ultimately, they did a little bit of that, but he just never did it at the NHL level. And he became not a cap anchor, but a buried salary for a team that can't really afford much buried salary in the Tampa Bay Lightning. And so all of that backstory to say the past few years for Philippe Myers has been kind of strange. The key is that he kind of found his form last season again, and he comes to Toronto now, actually being paid by Toronto on their cap sheet and looking to earn NHL minutes. I'm not sure if he will actually make the team out of camp, just given the current roster construction, but I could definitely see it if the Hakanpää thing doesn't end up happening. I think it does end up happening, but let's just say it doesn't. Then all of a sudden there's one less right-hand shot on the roster. He fits the size profile. He's still in his mid-20s, coming off of an excellent defensive season in the AHL. Takes a lot of the boxes that Toronto's looking for, at least in a depth defenseman, over somebody like Connor Timmins. I could absolutely see Philippe Myers making the Leafs out of camp, or at least being a player that plays a lot more NHL minutes than we anticipated. I think you look back to last year and you look at somebody like Simon Benoit. Things didn't really start very well for him being injured in camp and having a couple of terrible preseason games, being waived, all that kind of stuff, but more so being a player that people didn't really see playing a notable role for the Maple Leafs, and ended up being kind of a top 4 defenseman at times for the Maple Leafs and playing legitimate minutes in the playoffs. And I'm not saying that Philippe Myers is going to be something like that, but when you look at how Benoit came from a terrible Ducks team, was kind of not really considered for any realistic NHL role or minutes, but ended up getting that through some injury issues and kind of opportunity coming because of that. Philippe Myers could absolutely be a player that falls in a similar mold to be somebody that's not really on anyone's radar after playing in the AHL last year, but getting back to the NHL, fitting a size profile that the Leafs clearly want, and being somebody that can move the puck a little bit as well and kind of does a little bit more than just be a big body that can play, that's a bit of a plug and play type player. So I'm very excited to get to my conversation now with the voice of the Syracuse Crunch, the director of broadcasting there with the Tampa Bay Lightning AHL affiliate, Lukas Favale, to talk a little bit about what Myers was the past couple of seasons, how his game kind of developed last year with the team, and see potentially what he could bring to the Marlies or even the Maple Leafs this upcoming season. Very excited to welcome onto the show now Syracuse Crunch director of broadcasting and the voice of the Crunch, Lukas Favale. Lukas, thank you for taking the time and jumping on today.
Of course. Great to be here.
Yeah, so today we're talking a little bit about Philippe Myers, a player that you've seen quite a bit the past couple of years. So just jumping straight into things, what kind of player do you get when Phil Myers hits the ice?
Yeah, Phil, he was with the Crunch for the last and the Lightning organization the last couple of years. And I tell you, he was a really important piece for the organization and for the Crunch in particular for the last 2 years. And last year, he spent most of the season in Syracuse, spent a lot of the previous year as well with the Crunch, but he saw more time in Tampa Bay that year. But just such a, in the AHL level at least, and obviously that's where from the Crunch perspective, we saw him an elite defenseman. He was, a top pairing defenseman for sure. He had a phenomenal season, excellent defensively, can produce offensively if he wants to, but that was not what the organization wanted. In particular, last year, they wanted him to focus more on just the defensive side of things and bring that every game. And he did. I mean, he was phenomenal. It was hard to find him out of position on the ice, throughout the course of the season, often at all. Like, he was just such a solid defenseman for a team that was good defensively, but it was really young. There was a lot of inexperienced players that were coming along, and we saw a lot of NHL debuts from Tampa's perspective on the back end, which was great. But that meant there was a lot of young players here in Syracuse who were developing and getting that opportunity throughout the course of the year. So he was kind of that rock on the back end for the Crunch, and he's a player who can do a lot, in particular on the defensive end.
Yeah, and you mentioned that defensive end, and obviously the 6'6" frame, the huge reach and things like that. That's going to help out a lot on the defensive side. And so the defensive side is kind of the big strength with Phil Myers here, and kind of that reach and size being such a huge advantage for him.
Yeah, for sure. He uses his size well. He's a physical freak. He really is. He's in great shape all the time, and I remember last year, Dan Jacob, who was an assistant coach of the Crunch, no longer, he spent his 1 year here and decided to head back for personal reasons up to Quebec. But he coached the Crunch's defense, and he always raved. And I remember this conversation in particular at just a pregame meal on the road somewhere. I don't remember where, but he was just talking about just the space that he covers in the zone and how quickly he gets from one spot, maybe it's the corner, to the front of the net, like how quickly he covers ground in his own zone. And he was just marveling at how effective of a player he was last year. He had become. I mean, he's always been a good defenseman, but it felt like he was taking just another step last year in that side of the ice. And he uses that reach, he uses his mobility, he uses that the physical side that he has, and just such a force, like I said, in the D zone for the Crunch and for wherever he is this upcoming year.
Yeah, and so looking at that, it's kind of Syracuse's roster last year. You mentioned some of the inexperience and kind of the roster flow, partially due to injuries at the Tampa Bay level and kind of having some of those defensemen that you maybe anticipated being on the Crunch roster for most, if not all of the season, and spending instead most of the season or all the season on the Lightning roster. And so can you kind of describe maybe what the mix was like on defense over the course of the season for the Crunch and how Phil kind of filled that void and being a top pair guy and kind of an anchor on the Crunch roster?
Yeah, for sure. It was a year that, we didn't know. You never know in the AHL what your team is going to look like, right? It's always, you have maybe an idea in July.
Educated guesses, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. This is going to be the team we think. And then someone surprises in camp, and then there's injuries and whatever it might be, and you have a whole different roster. But, you look at that back end the Crunch had last year, and we knew there was potential to be really good. But you never knew because you had a lot of first and second year guys coming in. You had Emil Lilleberg coming over from Europe. You had Max Crozier, who we saw at the tail end of the previous season for, a handful of games coming out of college. Declan Carlisle just finished his first year. Jack Thompson had just finished his first year. So there was a lot of young pieces who were expected to be contributors to the Crunch, but you just don't know what they're going to be. And then you had Phil Myers, who was kind of, he's not old, but he was definitely the veteran of the bunch. The only veteran of that group, and you kind of had to rely on him to be that rock in that place. And then he kind of helped guide along with the coaching staff, and you got to give those players credit as well. But all of those guys made their NHL debut last year in Carlisle and Crozier and Thompson and Lilleberg, and it was you had a lot of moving parts throughout the course of the year because of that. And Phil, he had a couple of games up in Tampa Bay as well, but he was mainly in Syracuse and just a guy you could rely on every game to be at his best, and to, whoever else was playing, because there was a lot of, I don't know the exact number, it might have been 10, 11, 12, 13. I'd have to look. I might pull it up as we're talking here, how many defensemen the Crunch played last year, because it was a lot.
Just looking on Elite Prospects, I think it might have been like 14, 15 even. There was a lot.
Yeah, I'll pull it up here as we're going. But he was the guy who played, I think, just about more than anyone, and was as important a player for the Crunch and their success. And they were battling for division title right to the end of the year. They led the division in long stretches of the season. They ended up falling short on the very last day of the year in terms of the division title. But he was the big reason why. And like I said, put up some points, but plus minus, I know is some people like that stat. Some people hate that stat of the AHL. It's one of the stats we have to go with because the analytics aren't quite there like it is in the NHL. And he was almost a plus 30, and I think he was, 20 ahead of his next closest teammate or close to it. So it's a flawed stat, but it still shows something. And he had a very good year. And just like I said, he was the rock on that back end for the Crunch, and they needed him as there was a lot of moving parts throughout the year.
Yeah, plus minus is an interesting one where I think in the murky middle, it doesn't really mean a whole bunch, but it kind of tells you a lot on the extremes. And just looking at the Crunch roster, like you mentioned, like a plus 29, and I think the next closest was plus 11 or plus 12. Yeah. And so those elite, even strength results, not necessarily being power play quarterback or anything like that, but being that rock at even strength and being the veteran of the group, like you mentioned, at only 26, 27 years old, being the most experienced piece on that back end. I think it's just looking at from the outside, I think it's fair to say that he was one of the big leaders on that defense group this past season.
Yeah, for sure. There's no doubt about it. And it was 17 different defensemen played last year for the Crunch. So,
wow, 17. Yeah.
So his 61 games on the back end tied for the most on the team, which is impressive. It's pretty good. And, it just shows you how important he was. And He never had a letter on his jersey throughout the course of the year. He was not, considered one of those quote leaders in terms of that perspective, but he was a leader, whether he had the letter on his jersey or not. And you rely on someone like that who's been in the NHL, who's played playoff games in the NHL, who's played playoff games in the AHL, who's seen a lot in his career. Remember, he's undrafted. He came along and developed really well from where he was in the queue back in the day to where he is now. So got to give him a lot of credit. And someone like that who has had a different path than others is always good to have in the dressing room as a voice to, everyone goes through the ups and downs throughout the season, especially if you're a young player. And especially if you're in the American Hockey League, it's not an easy league to play in if you're coming out of college or coming out of junior. So he was an important piece from that perspective for the Crunch. And no doubt he was the leader on the blue line for this team.
Yeah, and one of those big changes that happened last year for the Crunch, of course, was a new head coach and Joel Bouchard coming in. How did you see kind of the team style change when Bouchard took over the team last year?
Yeah, it was just a more structured team, it felt like. It was a team that you really – and again, going back to Phil, he was a big reason why, because he's such a good defenseman. But it was a team that didn't have the most skill, but was hard to really create against. They didn't give up a lot of shots. They were so sound in their defensive zone, and it's all five players on the ice. It's not only the defensemen, the forwards are a big part of that as well. But they knew how they had to win. They had to rely on their structure. They couldn't extend too much. They had to play in that style all year, because they were outskilled most of the time. Now, at the end of the year, the Crunch had Alex Barré-Boulet back on their roster for the second half of the year, which certainly
that definitely helps.
Yeah, it changed the makeup of the team a bit. And he is what he is at this level. He's an elite scorer at this level, which is great. But outside of that, they have. I don't want to say there was no skill on the team. Obviously, there was some skill, but it was not. Most nights the other team had more skill, so they had to rely on just their structure. Joel preached that. The team responded to it well. The rest of the leadership, the Gabriel Dumonts, the Daniel Walcotts, who captain, assistant captain on this team, the veterans who've been around for a long time, really helped implement that from the roster down and from the captain down, which is great. And that was how they had to win. And the defense were a big part of it. The forwards are a big part of it. And everyone really bought into that approach of, just playing in that structured game and just finding those opportunities and taking advantage when it happened.
Yeah, and so Bouchard comes in last season, the second season for Myers, primarily in Syracuse. How did you see Myers' game kind of change over those two seasons with Bouchard at the helm, and kind of how did you see his role kind of evolve last season as well?
Yeah, it's like I said, last year in particular, the team and the organization really wanted him to focus on just the defensive side of the game. He's a great skater. He can get up the ice. He can get up and down the ice. He can, if he wants to jump up on the rush, he can, and at times he did. But they really, for the most part, wanted him to be more of that defensive defenseman who they could rely on, for tons of minutes, rely on in the D zone, and control the game in that way. And he certainly did that. His first year here, he was a little more, I don't want to say run and gun, but he was more willing to jump up on the rush, and it worked out in that regard too. He had a good year. The previous year with the Crunch, he had a couple of overtime winners. He had some big goals for the team. He was a big part of that group as well. But just the way, he embraced kind of dialing his game back a bit, focusing more on the defensive end. In his mind, I think it would open up more opportunities in the NHL for him. He got a couple of more games in Tampa Bay last year. And just from the AHL perspective, again, I think it made him one of the top defensemen at this level in this league, and just the way he played.
Yeah, and one of the interesting parts about Myers here is when he was traded to Tampa, he was making NHL money, $2.5 million. There was even some thought at the time that he could potentially be a buyout candidate, just given his age and some of the weird cap stuff that goes on with that. Instead, he was actually re-signed back in 2022 for another season, and he played this past season on that contract. And so a player in that scenario playing primarily in the AHL is a bit uncommon, but can also be something that puts the player in a difficult position. But it seems, based off of the way that you're describing him here, that Phil kind of took things in stride and really focused on his game and developing at the AHL level and taking the opportunity in stride.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And, no one wants to be in Syracuse or in the AHL or whatever, especially if you're a player like that. If you got that contract, it's kind of a shot to the ego a bit when you go on waivers and no one clears you or whatever, or no one claims you or whatever it might be, whatever the situation might be. But he came in, he had a great attitude. I've been around for a while now. You never know when someone like that is joining your team, what you're going to get. And fortunately for me, fortunately for the Crunch and this organization, there has been very few, if any, kind of grumpy guys who come down, don't want to be here. You can tell, there always is someone, and they'll eventually come around. But no, he was kind of ready to put in the work right away. He knew the situation. I think the organization, what Tampa does so well is they're upfront with their players. They're honest. You kind of have an idea where you are. You have an opportunity. It's not like you're getting sent down and if you might be playing great, you don't have a chance. That's not the way things run. They're going to give you an opportunity if you deserve the opportunity. So I think that certainly helps when you're a player like that who might not want to be here, but knows if you're putting in the work on and off the ice, if you're being, a good person, a good teammate, all of that stuff. If you're playing well, you're going to have the opportunity, if there is an opportunity in the NHL to make another crack at things up there. And he got that chance and, played well enough in those games. It just, he didn't stick because the pieces were, maybe the stars weren't aligned, the pieces weren't in place at that moment. But, he was a hard worker on and off the ice, always a good presence, whether it's in the locker room, whether it's on a practice day, whatever it might be. So there was no complaints from the organization from that perspective.
And over the course of a couple seasons, a couple of playoff runs as well in that mix. And I would imagine one of the big highlights of Phil Myers' career with the Crunch there is that Game 1 overtime winner, not this past season, but I believe the year before against Rochester. So can you just kind of take me through the kind of overtime heroics a little bit of Phil Myers, and if there are any other big moments that kind of stand out over his Crunch career for yourself?
Well, it was so funny, though. He went through a stretch that year. So 2 years ago, it was the spring of 23 now. He had 3 overtime. He had 0 overtime winners in his career in the AHL, and he had 3 in like a month. He had one at Wilkes-Barre. He had one, I don't remember, it might have been Rochester again in the regular season. He had that Game 1 in the playoffs. It just was an incredible run for him. He was becoming the hero at the moment for the team. And it was a really good team. It was, that year, unfortunately for the Crunch, he lost to Rochester. It was a really good series, 2 really good teams going back and forth. But no, he had some big time moments. That is, like you said, probably the pinnacle, that overtime winner in the playoffs. But
tough to top an OT winner in the playoffs.
Yeah, and a Game 1 to kick it off against
right. Yeah,
it was awesome. But no, he had some big moments. The scoring obviously dropped a bit, like we've talked about this year, because he was not focused on it as much. But still had some big goals and big assists, whatever it might have been. But no, for sure, I think just that moment in Game 1, and then just being on the ice throughout the course of this past season, and being such a factor for a really good team again this year is going to stick out in my mind.
Awesome. Well, Lukas, thank you for taking the time in the middle of the summer here, and enjoy the rest of your summer as quick as it's gone by, and best of luck this upcoming season.
I appreciate it. Yeah, we're going to try to drag it out as long as we can, but looking forward to the year when it starts.
Thanks again to Lukas for joining the show. That's going to do it for this one. Be sure to check out the 2 previous episodes of Leafs Camp Countdown if you haven't already, on Ben Danford and Nick Matanen. But that's going to do it for this one. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you tomorrow for more Camp Countdown. Have a good one. We'll see you next time.